The sun hung low in the sky, casting golden streaks over the endless stretch of trees and winding paths. Adia walked with a steady pace, her sandals brushing against the dusty road as she made her way toward her uncle's village. The journey was supposed to be simple, a day's walk through familiar trails, but she had left later than planned. Her mother's parting words echoed in her mind, "Do not linger on the road, child. The forest is no place for a lone traveler after dark." But Adia was fearless. She had grown up hearing stories about the forest spirits and their tricks, but she was a woman now, not a child to be frightened by old tales. Besides, she had taken this road before. She knew the way. The sky darkened faster than she expected, heavy clouds rolling in like silent warnings. A distant rumble of thunder made her glance upward. The air grew thick, the wind carrying the scent of rain and damp earth. Then, as if the heavens had been waiting for the perfect moment, the storm struck. Rain poured down in thick sheets, drenching her in moments. The dirt path turned slick beneath her feet, slowing her pace. Lightning illuminated the darkening sky, followed by a deafening crack of thunder that made her heart race. She had no choice, she needed shelter. Her eyes darted toward the towering trees lining the road. She hesitated for a moment before stepping off the path and into the dense forest. The moment she entered, the sounds of the storm seemed muted, swallowed by the thick canopy above. She pushed forward, searching for a safe place to wait out the rain. The deeper she went, the more unfamiliar everything became. Trees twisted into strange shapes, their gnarled roots reaching out like grasping fingers. Shadows stretched unnaturally in the fading light, and every rustling leaf sent a shiver down her spine. Minutes passed, maybe hours. The rain did not let up, and the forest grew darker. The realization hit her with a cold grip, she could no longer see the road. Panic gnawed at her confidence. Had she taken a wrong turn? She spun in circles, trying to retrace her steps, but every direction looked the same. The trees were unmarked, the path behind her erased by the storm's fury. A sudden gust of wind sent a whisper through the leaves, almost like a voice calling her name. She turned sharply, her breath quickening. The forest was alive with sounds, soft cracks, distant movements, something unseen shifting in the darkness. She was lost. And she was not alone. Adia's heart pounded in her chest as she moved blindly through the trees, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the storm had left the forest in an eerie silence. The air was thick with moisture, carrying the scent of wet earth and decaying leaves. Every step she took seemed to echo louder than it should, as though the forest itself was listening. She tried to calm herself, forcing deep breaths through her nose, but it did little to ease the growing sense of dread in her gut. She had been walking for what felt like hours, yet the trees around her looked no different. The path, if there had ever been one, had long disappeared beneath her feet. The forest was endless, stretching in every direction with no sign of an opening. Then came the whispers. At first, she thought it was the wind, slipping through the gaps in the trees. But as she listened, the sounds grew clearer, soft, unintelligible murmurs, like voices speaking just beyond her understanding. They seemed to come from all around her, weaving between the branches, growing louder when she stopped and fading when she moved. She turned sharply, scanning the darkness for movement. Nothing. Only the sway of leaves in the breeze. Her pulse quickened. Is someone there, she thought. The logical part of her mind told her it was her imagination, a trick played by exhaustion and fear. But deep inside, something told her she was not alone. A rustling sound to her left made her spin in that direction. Her eyes darted between the thick trunks, trying to pierce the darkness. Then she saw them. Eyes. Not just one pair, but several. They glowed faintly, like dying embers in the night. Some were close to the ground, others higher, watching her from the branches above. She couldn't tell if they belonged to animals or something else entirely. But they did not blink. They did not move. They only stared. Adia's legs trembled, but she forced herself to take a step back. The moment she moved, the eyes shifted. A branch creaked somewhere behind her. A low, guttural sound, something between a growl and a whisper, sent a chill racing down her spine. Panic surged through her veins. She bolted. She ran without direction, dodging low-hanging branches and leaping over fallen logs. The whispers followed, growing urgent, like voices warning her to stop. The eyes flickered in and out of sight, appearing between the gaps in the trees. Her foot caught on a root, and she fell hard, the breath knocked from her lungs. Pain shot up her ankle, but she had no time to think about it. She scrambled to her feet and pressed forward, forcing herself to keep going despite the burning in her legs. Then, through the shifting darkness, she saw it, a small structure, barely visible between the trees. A hut. It was old, its thatched roof partially caved in, the wooden walls covered in moss. Smoke no longer rose from its chimney, and the door hung slightly open, as if waiting for her to step inside. Adia hesitated. Every instinct screamed for her to stay away. But behind her, the whispers were growing louder, the eyes closing in. She had no choice. She limped toward the hut, gripping the edges of her soaked dress as she pushed through the undergrowth. The wooden steps groaned under her weight as she reached the doorway. The inside was shrouded in darkness, but it was shelter. A place to hide. With one last glance at the watching eyes, she stepped inside. And the whispers stopped. The air inside the hut was thick with the scent of damp wood and old ash. Adia's breath was ragged as she leaned against the doorway, her body trembling from exhaustion and fear. The whispering voices had stopped the moment she entered, but the silence that followed was almost worse. It pressed against her ears, heavy and unnatural. She took a cautious step forward, her eyes scanning the room. The hut was small and sparse, an old wooden table sat in the corner, covered in dust and cobwebs. A few clay pots lay scattered near a cold fire pit, their contents long forgotten. A tattered mat was spread across the floor, and against the far wall rested a bundle of dried grass that might have once been used as a bed. Adia swallowed hard. Is this place truly abandoned? A sudden noise outside made her stiffen. It was the snap of a twig, someone was approaching. She pressed herself against the wall, barely daring to breathe. Heavy footsteps crunched against the damp earth, moving toward the entrance. Then, in the dim light of the doorway, a figure appeared. He was tall, his frame lean but strong, dressed in a dark animal hide cloak. His face was partially hidden beneath a hood, but his sharp eyes gleamed like polished stones, reflecting the dim moonlight. A bow was slung over his shoulder, and in his right hand, he gripped a long spear. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, the man tilted his head slightly, studying her. "You are not from this forest," he said, his voice deep and measured. Adia hesitated before answering. I lost my way." The man stepped closer, lowering his spear. "Few enter this place and leave unchanged. You are lucky to have found this hut." He glanced at the doorway as if expecting something to be standing there. "Or perhaps, it found you." A shiver ran down her spine. The man let out a low sigh and set his spear against the wall. "You should not be wandering alone in these woods, especially at night." Adia swallowed. "Who are you?" He pulled back his hood, revealing a face hardened by years of survival. His cheekbones were sharp, his dark skin marred by faint scars, and his eyes, there was something in them that made her uneasy. A knowledge that ran deeper than it should. "I am Django," he said. "A hunter. A protector of the forest." Adia frowned. "Protector?" Django walked past her, moving toward the cold fire pit. He knelt and pulled a small pouch from his cloak, sprinkling dry leaves and herbs onto the ashes. Then, striking a flint against stone, he coaxed a small flame to life. "There are things in this forest," he said without looking at her. "Old things. Spirits. Curses. Some seek to harm, others to guide. And some," he glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "Some only watch, waiting for the right moment." A cold dread settled in her chest. Django gestured for her to sit near the fire. "You must be hungry. Sit. Eat." She hesitated but knew she had no other choice. Cautiously, she lowered herself onto the floor as Django pulled a bundle from his satchel, unwrapping dried meat and a small gourd of water. Adia took the food, her stomach twisting in both hunger and apprehension. She ate in silence, her eyes flicking toward him now and then. His movements were slow, deliberate, as if he was always listening to something beyond what she could hear. After a while, he spoke again. "You should rest. At first light, I will take you to the edge of the forest." Adia nodded, exhaustion creeping over her. She was grateful for the fire's warmth, but something about Django still unsettled her. She could not place it. Perhaps it was the way his eyes lingered on her for just a moment too long, or the way his voice carried an underlying weight, as if he knew something she did not. She lay down on the tattered mat, wrapping her arms around herself as the fire crackled softly. The room flickered in shifting shadows, and Django sat nearby, sharpening his knife, his gaze distant. Sleep came slowly, dragging her down in uneasy waves. Somewhere in the depths of the night, Adia stirred. A strange feeling crept over her, an awareness that made her skin prickle. The fire had dimmed, casting only faint embers against the walls. The air felt heavy, like the silence before a storm. Then she felt it. A presence. The unmistakable sensation of being watched. Her breath hitched in her throat, but she did not move. Her heart pounded against her ribs as she listened for something, anything. The hut was still. Django had stopped sharpening his knife. The forest outside was silent. Slowly, ever so slowly, she turned her head. Django sat in the same place, but he was not asleep. He was watching her. His face was calm, his expression unreadable, but his eyes held something dark, something unreadable. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, without a word, Django shifted his gaze back to the dying fire and continued sharpening his knife. Adia closed her eyes, but sleep did not come again. Adia woke to the soft crackling of the fire, its glow reduced to smoldering embers. For a moment, she remained still, her body aching from the cold, hard floor. The weight of the previous night pressed upon her, the eerie whispers, the glowing eyes, and most unsettling of all, Django's silent gaze in the darkness. She turned her head slightly. Django sat where he had been before, his blade glinting in the dim firelight as he ran it along a whetstone. His movements were slow, methodical. "You did not sleep," she murmured. He didn't look at her. "The forest does not sleep. One must always be vigilant." Adia sat up cautiously, wrapping her arms around herself. "You said you would take me to the edge of the forest at first light." She glanced toward the entrance. The world outside was still cloaked in darkness, but she could sense dawn approaching. Django finally met her gaze. "It is not safe for you to leave." Her heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" Django leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "There are spirits in this forest, Adia. They prey on the lonely, the lost. Women who wander too far do not return the same." His voice was calm, but there was an undercurrent of something else, something possessive. Adia swallowed. "You said you were a protector. That you would help me." "I am protecting you," he said simply. "If you leave now, they will find you. You are marked." She stiffened. "Marked?" Django tilted his head slightly, studying her as if seeing something she could not. "You heard them, didn't you? The whispers. They called to you." A chill crept up her spine. I don't know what I heard." He sighed, shaking his head. "They have already seen you. They know you are here." Adia clenched her fists. She didn't believe in spirits, at least not in the way he described them. But she did no fear. She had felt it in the depths of the night, when she had sensed eyes watching her. "How do you know so much about them?" she asked. Django's expression darkened. "Because I have seen what they do." He stood abruptly, walking to the entrance of the hut. "Come," he said. "Let me show you something." Hesitant but unwilling to refuse, Adia followed him outside. The air was damp with morning mist, the trees towering like silent sentinels. Django led her a short distance from the hut, stopping beside a large tree. At first, she didn't see it. Then, her breath caught. Carved into the bark were dozens of symbols, crude and jagged. Some resembled eyes, others open mouths, screaming faces. But what truly horrified her were the handprints, small, delicate, like those of women. "This is where they take them," Django murmured. "The ones who do not listen." Adia took a step back. "I don't understand. Who are they?" Django turned to her, his eyes intense. "The spirits. The forest itself. You cannot leave, Adia." "Not yet." Something inside her snapped. "I don't believe you," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I think you are the one keeping me here." Django's expression remained unreadable. "Believe what you wish," he said. "But if you leave, you will not return the same." Adia knew she couldn't stay. Whatever Django's intentions were, they were not pure. That night, she lay awake, listening to the rhythmic sharpening of his knife. The air felt suffocating, the walls of the hut closing in. She had to escape. Slipping silently from her mat, she moved toward the entrance, pausing only when she heard Django shift in his sleep. She exhaled slowly and stepped outside, the cool night air a stark contrast to the heat pounding in her chest. The trees loomed ahead, dark and endless. She ran. The moment her feet hit the forest floor, the air seemed to change. The trees blurred together, their branches twisting unnaturally. The ground beneath her softened, pulling at her steps. The whispers returned, urgent and unrelenting. She runs. She flees. She belongs to us. Adia clamped her hands over her ears, her pulse a wild drumbeat. Then, footsteps. Fast. Chasing. "Django." She pushed forward, her breath ragged, her body trembling with terror. Then, the forest shifted. The path ahead of her twisted, curving back toward the hut. No matter which direction she turned, the trees folded in, her escape sealing shut. A trap. She stumbled to a halt, panting, heart hammering. A voice, calm and knowing, whispered just behind her ear. "Asterisk, you cannot leave." Asterisk. She turned. Django stood there, watching her. And he was smiling. Adia stumbled through the forest, her breath ragged, her heart a frantic drum in her chest. The branches clawed at her skin, but she did not slow down. She had to get away from Django. Away from his stories. Away from the suffocating walls of that hut. The forest had twisted on itself, forcing her back before, but she could not stop trying. This time, she felt she was making progress. The trees seemed thinner, the path widening. Then, voices. She froze, heart pounding. Ahead, beyond a thick cluster of trees, the glow of a fire flickered. Shadows moved, laughter echoed in the night. Adia hesitated. Were these villagers? Could they help her? Or was this another trick of the forest? Steeling herself, she stepped closer, peering through the foliage. A group of men sat around a fire, their faces illuminated by the golden flames. They were dressed like traders, their garments worn from travel, their belongings scattered around them, packs, weapons, sacks of goods. Their laughter was loud, their voices thick with drink. She took another cautious step forward, and the movement caught the attention of one of them. A man with sharp features and a thick beard turned his head sharply. His eyes met hers, and a slow smile spread across his face. "Well, what do we have here?" he said, standing up. The other men turned, their expressions shifting from surprise to curiosity. Adia swallowed her fear and stepped out fully into the firelight. "Please," she said, her voice trembling. "I am lost. I need help." A tall man, possibly their leader, stood up. His frame was imposing, his face unreadable. He studied her for a long moment before nodding. "You are far from any village, girl. What are you doing out here alone?" She hesitated, unsure how much to say. I was traveling to visit my relatives, she said finally. I lost my way in the storm. The men exchanged glances. One of them chuckled under his breath. The leader nodded again. You must be exhausted. Come, sit. Rest by the fire. Adia hesitated. Something about them unsettled her. But the fire was warm, and exhaustion pulled at her limbs. She was desperate. She moved cautiously toward them and sat near the edge of the fire's glow. One of the men handed her a bowl of food. She accepted it, her fingers shaking. The men resumed their talk, occasionally glancing at her. She listened carefully, trying to decipher their intentions. They spoke of trade routes, stolen goods, and deals made in secret. These were no simple merchants. As the night deepened, the air shifted. The men's gazes lingered on her for too long. Their voices lowered, their laughter fading into something more dangerous. She felt it before they moved, the moment the air turned against her. A hand brushed her shoulder. She jerked away. Easy now, the bearded man said, grinning. We're just being friendly. Adia's stomach twisted. She rose to her feet. I should go. The leader stood, blocking her path. His smile didn't reach his eyes. Go where? The forest is not kind to a woman alone. The other men stood as well, their movements slow, deliberate. A circle was forming. Adia's pulse thundered. She had escaped Django only to fall into something worse. The whispers in the trees returned. She didn't think, she ran. Laughter followed her. And then, the chase began. Adia ran, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The forest blurred around her, shadows twisting in the flickering firelight behind her. The men were close, too close. She could hear their heavy footsteps crashing through the undergrowth, their laughter turning into something darker, more eager. She runs fast, one of them taunted. Not for long, another chuckled. Adia's heart pounded against her ribs. She couldn't outrun them forever. She needed a plan. She needed to think. Up ahead, the trees split into two paths, one leading deeper into the dense forest, the other toward a cluster of jagged rocks. She veered toward the rocks, her mind racing. If she could lead them into confusion, turn them against each other. She grabbed a fallen branch as she ran, letting it drag in the dirt behind her, creating a false trail. Then, she pivoted sharply, slipping into the shadow of a boulder, pressing herself against the cold stone. Her body screamed for rest, but she forced herself to be still. The men crashed into the clearing seconds later. Where is she? One of them growled. She went this way, another said, pointing to the trail Adia had deliberately made. The men hesitated, glancing at each other. She's clever, the leader muttered. But not clever enough. We split up. Fan out. She's close. Adia clenched her fists, steadying her breathing. She had to move before they found her hiding spot. Then, an idea sparked. She reached down and grabbed a small stone, then hurled it toward the opposite direction. It struck the trunk of a tree with a sharp crack. There, one of them shouted. Two of the men took off in that direction. The leader hesitated, eyes scanning the shadows. Adia knew she needed to create more doubt, more division. With the softest whisper, she called out, "Help!" The leader spun around, eyes narrowing. What was that? Another man asked. Adia repeated the whisper, letting her voice drift like a ghost through the trees. The spirits, one of them muttered, his bravado faltering. The cursed ones. They say the forest. Shut up, the leader snapped. Adia pressed her advantage. Help me. You promised, she whispered again, throwing her voice as much as she could. The men exchanged uneasy glances. The girl is tricking us, one of them said. The leader looked around, his grip tightening on his weapon. Enough. We find her now. But the seed of fear had been planted. Then, the wind shifted. A brittle, raspy voice cut through the air. Those who harm the lost shall suffer the curse. The men froze. From the darkness, an old woman emerged. She was hunched, wrapped in tattered robes, her eyes milky white. The firelight flickered against her gaunt face. Adia had never seen her before. The men stumbled back. Who, what? You know the stories, the old woman hissed. You know the price for harming one who is lost. The leader's face darkened. Superstition. The old woman lifted a skeletal finger. Then tell me, why do your hands tremble? The men glanced down, and gasped. A dark stain spread across their fingers, their skin cracking, veins blackening. The curse is real, the old woman whispered. One of the men shrieked, dropping his knife, clutching his hand. No! No, this isn't happening. Another stumbled back, horror twisting his face. Only the leader remained still, his jaw tight. This is a trick. Adia knew she had to act now. She stepped from the shadows. Let me go, she said firmly. Before it's too late. The leader hesitated. His men, now panicked, turned on him. You brought us into this, one of them spat. You said it was just a girl. She's cursed us, another howled. The leader clenched his fists. Then, with a furious growl, he turned to Adia. This isn't over. But it was. His men were already fleeing into the night, screaming as they clawed at their darkening skin. The leader took one last glance at the old woman, then at his own hands, where the first traces of black veins had begun to form. Then, he ran. The old woman turned to Adia, her white eyes unreadable. You are safe, for now, she murmured. Adia swallowed, her knees weak. Who are you? The old woman only smiled, the fire casting long shadows across her face. The forest watches, she said. And it chooses. Then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, she was gone. The forest was not done with them. As the men fled into the night, their screams echoed through the trees. The leader ran the fastest, his breath ragged, his heart pounding like a war drum. His men scattered in different directions, their terror turning them into prey. Then, the first misfortune struck. One of the men, the bearded one who had laughed at Adia earlier, suddenly tripped. The ground beneath him wasn't solid, it moved. Quicksand. He clawed at the mud, his fingers slipping as he sank deeper. Help! Someone help me! The others turned, but fear held them back. No one dared step closer. The bearded man's screams grew desperate as the earth swallowed him whole. His cries faded, leaving only the restless murmur of the trees. The leader gritted his teeth. Keep moving! But the forest was alive with vengeance. Another man stumbled into a thicket of vines, only to realize too late that they moved, tightening around his limbs, slithering like living ropes. He shrieked, thrashing, but the vines dragged him upward, disappearing into the canopy. His screams turned to gurgles, then silence. The remaining men bolted in blind panic, tripping over roots, crashing through the undergrowth. But the forest had already chosen its punishment. A shadow moved between the trees, something massive, unseen yet present. A guttural growl rumbled in the distance, growing closer. The third man barely had time to turn before a pair of glowing eyes locked onto his. A scream, then nothing. The leader kept running. His breath came in ragged gasps. He had always been the predator, never the prey. But tonight, the forest had flipped the rules. Then, he saw it, a clearing, an opening. He sprinted toward it, but as he did, the ground beneath him gave way. He tumbled into a deep, hollow pit lined with jagged bones, skulls and ribs half buried in the dirt. A graveyard of the cursed. He tried to climb, but the walls crumbled under his fingers. The whispers in the wind grew louder, the voices of those who had come before him. He screamed. Somewhere far away, Adia listened. The old woman stood beside her, silent as the trees. It is done, she whispered. Adia turned to her, heart still pounding. What was this place? The forest is a keeper of balance, the woman said. Those who seek to harm the innocent will always answer to it. Adia shuddered. And you? Who are you? The woman smiled, her white eyes glowing softly. Just a guide. She turned, stepping through a cluster of trees, and to Adia's shock, the trees parted, revealing a narrow, winding path. The way out. Adia hesitated only for a moment before following. The forest had taken its vengeance. Now, it was letting her go. Adia stepped out of the dense forest, her bare feet pressing against familiar soil. The towering trees behind her rustled one last time, as if whispering their final warning. She was free. But she would never be the same. As she approached her village, the first rays of morning painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Smoke curled from cooking fires, and the distant hum of daily life filled the air. Everything looked just as she had left it, but she felt like a stranger returning from a world no one else could see. A guard at the village entrance spotted her first. His eyes widened in shock. Adia? Others gathered, gasping in disbelief. A woman, her aunt, rushed forward and clutched Adia's arms. Child, we thought you were lost forever. Adia tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. How could she explain what had happened? How could she describe the horrors, the whispers, the old woman who had led her to safety? The village elders summoned her, their faces grave. You were taken by the forest, one of them said, his voice lined with age and caution. And yet, you have returned. Adia nodded. I was lost, but I found a way out. The elders exchanged glances. Finally, the oldest among them leaned forward. Did you see them? Adia hesitated. Who? The ones who never return. A shiver ran through her. She thought of the men, their screams, their disappearances, the eerie force that had consumed them. The forest is alive, another elder murmured. It does not forgive those who enter with ill intent. Many who go missing are not simply lost, they are claimed. Adia swallowed hard. But I was spared. The oldest elder nodded. Because you were never meant to be taken. A deep silence settled over the room. The spirits protect the innocent, the elder continued, but they punish the wicked. You have seen what happens to those who do not respect the forest. Adia lowered her gaze, remembering the leader's final scream, the way the trees had swallowed the others whole. The elders were right, the forest was more than just trees and shadows. It was something far older, far stronger. Finally, one of the women placed a gentle hand on Adia's shoulder. You have returned to us, child. But you must never speak of this again. Adia lifted her head, searching their faces. Why? Some places, the elder said solemnly, are meant to be feared and respected. Adia understood. Some things were not meant to be explained. As she stepped out of the elder's hut, the wind whispered through the trees, as if carrying a farewell from the unseen forces she had escaped. She looked once more at the dark outline of the forest in the distance. Then, she turned away, vowing never to enter it again. As time passed, the story of Adia's disappearance and return became a whispered legend among the villagers. No one spoke of it openly, but everyone knew she had seen something beyond the world of the living. The traitors were never seen again. Their names faded, their faces forgotten. But the forest remembered. Hunters who wandered too far spoke of strange happenings, shadows that moved when no one was near, trees that creaked without wind, and an unnatural silence that fell in certain parts of the woods. Some swore they heard distant cries at night, voices carried by the wind, pleading, screaming, then vanishing into the dark. Django's hut was gone. One day, a group of young men, curious and reckless, ventured to the spot where Adia had described it. But there was nothing, no walls, no roof, not even the ashes of a fire. It was as if Django had never existed. Yet, the forest told a different story. One of the boys, shaken and pale, returned to the village with trembling hands. I heard something, he whispered to the elders. What did you hear? They asked. The boy swallowed hard. A voice. A man's voice, calling for help. The elders exchanged knowing glances, their expressions grim. One of them, the oldest, spoke carefully. "You must never go back there." The boy nodded. He didn't need to be told twice. And then, there was the voice. Fishermen near the riverbank claimed they heard it first, a soft, sorrowful murmur in the distance, calling out to wandering men. It was neither entirely human nor entirely spirit, but something in between. A voice lost in time, cursed to repeat its plea forever. It did not call to women. Only men. Some claimed it was Django, forever trapped, seeking a way out of the forest that had swallowed him whole. Others believed it was one of the traitors, doomed to suffer for their wicked deeds. Whatever it was, it became a warning. Fathers told their sons, "Do not stray from the path." Mothers whispered to their children, "Never answer a voice in the trees." And those who had seen too much, who had heard too clearly, kept their silence. Because the forest was still watching. And the curse lived on. Adia never wanted to speak of the forest again. But as time passed, she realized she had no choice. She had survived when others had not. She had walked away from something that refused to let most go. And so, she told her story, not for sympathy, not for fame, but as a warning. Some listened with wide eyes, clutching their charms and muttering prayers. The elders nodded solemnly, for they already knew that such things lurked in the world. The forest was older than the village, older than their ancestors, and its secrets were not meant for men to uncover. But there were always those who refused to believe. "You are simply lost," they scoffed. "You imagine things in your fear." The traitors likely left on their own, others reasoned. There was no curse, no voices. Just the wild playing tricks on the mind. Adia did not argue. She had seen enough to know that fate had its own way of teaching lessons, sometimes through whispers, sometimes through terror. The forest remained untouched. No one dared to cut its trees or hunt too deep within its borders. Travelers avoided the narrow paths winding between the towering trunks. Even on the brightest days, the village children were warned to never play near its edge. But in the stillness of the night, when the world was at its quietest, the villagers swore they could hear something carried on the wind. A voice, soft, mournful, waiting. Some said Adia was lucky to have escaped. Others said she had been chosen. But Adia knew the truth. She had not been saved by luck. She had been spared by something far more powerful.